negotiation process, and in the past week and a half have actually announced an agreement on what their targets will be over the course of the next 30 to 40 years. This also coincides, by the way, with the EU announcing unilateral targets over the next 40 years. But the reason this is going to matter is if we start to see a breakthrough in climate negotiations, the hazards faced by an urbanizing population over the course of the 21st century may not be as complex or may not be as dramatic. The second issue that will determine these hazards is local and national policies, and that's some of what we've been hearing about, but I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about these. But one way we might want to think about this in terms of thinking about vulnerability of population is to take a simple case, one that you're probably all familiar with, the case of Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy hit the Newark region of the United States in October 28th, 2012. But a day and a half earlier, it sort of glanced or indirectly hit Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Now this gives us something like a comparison of two urban areas. Port-au-Prince is a much smaller urban area, but it's about 800,000 people. But it starts to help us see how policies around urbanization will shape impacts. And so New York, right, is hit, and it kills 53 people in New York State, the hurricane does, kills 117 people in the United States. 7.9 million buildings are without electricity over the course of a few weeks. And 9,000 people stay in 171 Red Cross shelters. 2 days later, JFK and Newark airports reopen with limited service, and the New York Stock Exchange reopens after its longest 2-day closure from weather in 70 years. Compare that to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, which was hit 2 days earlier with not the full force of the storm, but 4 days of very heavy rains. And what we get in Port-au-Prince is a highly vulnerable population, in part because in 2010, Port-au-Prince was hit with a very severe earthquake, I believe 7.0 on the Richter scale, which killed 200,000 people and displaced 400,000 people into the Port-au-Prince region from the countryside. So you have a population that is living largely in, similar to the buildings we've seen here, in shanties that are grouped around the periphery of a city, and then they are hit by a hurricane. Now, Hurricane Sandy kills 51 people in Haiti, which is almost the same number as were killed in New York State, despite a much smaller population in Port-au-Prince. The extensive flooding displaced even more people, but one of the things we see, and this starts to, I think, tell us a lot about the intersection of urbanization and climate change, is the flooding that hits Port-au-Prince and the follow-up, that is the water shortages that happen shortly thereafter, also promote a cholera outbreak that kills 7,500 more people in the months following Hurricane Sandy. We also see that we get a loss of 70 to 90%, depending on which part of the surrounding areas of Port-au-Prince. 70 to 90% of the harvest was affected and lost. And deforestation compounded the problem by causing mudslides. So due to time constraints, I can't necessarily go into all of the differences that each city will confront, but one of the things we can think about are some of the kind of similarities that cities will confront. And here, it's not the clearest graphic, but you get a sense in coloration of which are deemed the highest vulnerability of areas, that is, areas that have a great deal of exposure and also a low rating on the Human Development Index in terms of primarily GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita. And one of the things we see is greater heat extremes, which are compounded by urban heat islands. The extensive use of concrete in urban areas retains heat, and so we see, for instance, summertime in India, it is now not uncommon to see urban areas reach temperatures above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which this has pretty negative health impacts. We see decreasing water availability as rainfall patterns change, and we see more frequent droughts. Sea level is rising, and this has dramatic implications for places like Manila and Calcutta, which are going to be exposed in even larger numbers to tidal and storm surges. What we also see is saltwater intrusion, which in some places makes it very difficult to retain the potable water they already have, and they become much more dependent on rainfall, which they have to be able to trap. Finally, we have air quality as we get greater amounts of ground level ozone and particulate matter. And finally, food production. In one case, India, we've seen that there's a decline in yields of rice and wheat, and that this has required greater levels of fertilization or the use of fertilizer, even though there have been no greater results. Finally, we have shifting ecosystems within the biosphere. And what this means is we're starting to see new plants move in where old plants used to grow. And this is going to actually compound urbanization in places like sub-Saharan Africa, particularly along the west coast as we saw, because we're seeing in this particular diagram a shift and a projected shift based on historical data of plants that are grassy plants becoming replaced by woodier plants, which means people are not able to forage their animals there. And so their livestock can't live. They have to seek employment elsewhere, and so they're oftentimes driven to urban environments in order to seek employment. So I think I will wrap up there, and we can take questions.
Thank you, Brad. So, increase urbanization, increase risk through concentration, increase environmental impact as well. And I like to tell my students, most of you are students, that most of you in here today will live to see 90. You will live statistically to see 90. Actuarially, you will live to see 90. If you made it this far, you're doing good. You're gonna go a lot further. And so the things that we're talking about here may seem like a long way off, but you're gonna be around a long time. And you're gonna see, the real impacts of this stuff. So it's really important, I think, that we discuss this topic. We have the talent on our faculty. We have a very internationalized faculty who are from places where these things are really pressing problems, and they have a lot of knowledge that they're willing to share with us. And so, and we're a campus that likes to send students overseas to see what's going on over there, to get beyond our own little borders and see what the world is like, because the 21st century is the century of globalization and all that that means. So we put that in that context as well. Well, now we have 4 distinguished panelists, and so the floor is open for questions. Question.
I know you can't talk about everything in the 10-minute period of time, but I'm an epidemiologist, and I see a public health nightmare with those piles of garbage and the packing people together and the travel, the globalization, the potential for new disease spread easily in concentrated groups of people. And I was wondering, is there any public health effort in some of these areas? Any formal public health systems?
I'm going to repeat the question because I'm not sure those guys in the back could hear it. Could you hear it back there? Pretty well? Okay, public health impacts. Okay. Who wants to address that one?
I can talk about Kibera, the slump in Nairobi, Kenya.
Nice and loud, just so they can hear us well.
Okay, I can talk about Kibera, that's the slump in Nairobi, Kenya. If you think of Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya, there are about 2.5 million people living in slums in Nairobi. That's 60% of the population living on 6% of the land. So most of that 2.5 million people have no access to any sort of sanitation. And when it comes to health implications, there are no hospitals, there are no clinics. It's mostly NGOs and the United Nations that set up clinics, but the governments are not, how should I put this? It's not that they're not concerned, but they're not prioritizing providing those facilities. So it's a big problem there. When there's a disease outbreak, it just runs through that area, which is sad. If you think of rubbish city in Cairo, so people take their refuse, both human and all refuse, and then they store it on top of their houses. The picture I showed. These are breeding grounds for vector.
Disease, yeah. Is life expectancy up in the countries that you have talked about? Do we have good data on life expectancy?
In Southeast, after 1990, there are lots of improvements on education and health. So the life expectancy has increased in recent years.
Yeah.
And going back to the question about public health, right now in Nepal, what's happening is cities are where everything is concentrated. So cities are where we have the best hospitals, the best doctors. So far there has been no issues with public health. Because if you have money, you can get treated. So, but when cities become mega cities, I think that's going to be a huge issue.
I have two other questions.
Question, go ahead. Nice and loud.
The first one is, we already have a solution to urbanization and the problems of cities growing. It's called urbanization, setting a city limit. You set a city limit such as Seattle, Washington, whereas anywhere outside the city center, say 25 kilometers out, is no longer considered part of that city. If it's no longer considered that part of the city, it is exempt from all the tax deductions, all the safe havens, all the infrastructure of that city. So therefore, those people have to get together, make their own governments, and create their own way of doing things, instead of putting the pressure on one centralized local government, which is one of the issues doing. For instance, Seattle, Washington has a city limit. Anywhere outside the city limit of Seattle, Washington is no longer considered Seattle. So therefore, it is no longer the city of Seattle's problem. We're talking about governments that are controlling or trying to control an entire territory, an entire country, being focused in on cities, which is the problem. You're putting so much pressure on one government to control one thing when it should be the city's government taking care of that. Laying down infrastructure before you have the migration to the city, before you bring all these people. And instead of creating incentives for people to come to the city, you need to create incentives for infrastructure to begin first. So if you have so many people migrating to a city, why don't you have incentives for those people to help lay down infrastructure? Subsidies, ideas, public transportation. And second off, it's rather important to not consider Africa. When you talk about Africa, it's so important to not talk about it as, say, Africa. You have to talk about it as individual countries. Far too often do people just lump every country in Africa together as Africa, versus you have Sub-Saharan Africa and you have Mediterranean Africa, which has completely separate cultural identities, completely separate growth, completely separate histories. So the more we talk about Africa as one single thing, the more we create this negative connotation. We don't see the differences. We don't understand how each individual country, each individual state.
Okay, we get the question. We get it. Good points. Fish, do you want to?
Oh yeah, good. This is
I want to give everybody a chance to ask
I'm an
questions.
urban planner, so to tell me Seattle has found the solution is false. Portland, Oregon has an urban growth boundary. So this concept of trying to contain cities has been existing since the time of, you're familiar with the Garden City concept by Ebenezer Howard. Ebenezer Howard.
Okay.
He has what's called the Garden
100
City.
years ago.
Yes, 100 years ago. How to limit the growth of cities by creating a boundary. But those boundaries are artificial because you cannot control migration. So what you do is you artificially raise the price of what? Real estate properties. That's what happens. So it's not saying it's a solution, no. It's an attempt at growth management, but it's not a solution. That's what it is. That's my discipline, I'm an urban planner. So that's the first one. The second one is, in Africa, given the 10 minutes we have, we cannot cover all the cities. We're just talking of the main trends. That's what we all give. Look at data. What's the main trends? I can focus on Kebira alone. I can talk of Makoko. yes, there are differences, but when you're doing statistics, you want to be able to do what? Generalize. That's why you take a big sample, you look at it, and then you make inferences. But if you are taking a case study approach, then we look at individual ones. That's it. But given the 10 minutes constraint, we have to do what? Generalize. We're not saying they're all the same. I mean, for instance, if you look at North Africa, North Africa has the largest share of urban people living in urban areas, but it has the smallest proportion of what? Slums. But Sub-Saharan Africa, which has a smaller proportion of people living in urban areas, has the largest proportion of slums. What's happening there is the approaches they both take. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it's all about slum clearance. So the government just says, hey, we're going to bulldoze all these people. So what happens is what? They don't resettle them in places, so a new slums emerge somewhere else. But what Morocco is doing with their Cities Without Slums initiative, which they launched in 2004, is actually providing infrastructure, basic housing, and services. So basically what they're doing is they're upgrading the slums. That's why they have the smaller proportions. But within 10 minutes, we can't go into much detail.
Yeah, I understand that. And I appreciate that too, but I just thought maybe we should focus on like separate regions. Yeah.
10 minutes. I didn't even finish.
The urban growth boundary is a real important concept, though. We could draw a line around the city and say the city can't grow beyond this boundary. And Portland, Oregon has done that. Seattle has done that. Places have done that, but what happens is that it leads to a very high quality of life. People want to live inside the urban growth boundary, so it drives up real estate prices. I think that Portland's even expanding.
Yeah, Portland expands every 10 years.
Yeah, you got to make it.
And expand.
There are other things happening in Washington. Towns that were population 5,000, like Centralia, Chehalis, between Portland and Seattle on the I-5 corridor, are now population 35 to 50,000.
So they're moving there.
The villages have become towns, towns have become cities. And Olympia, Washington, population 25,000 in 1990 is now 250,000.
Yeah.
In the metro area. So you can limit it all you want. Seattle, somebody's going to go towards Seattle.
Nearby. Yeah, well, the world's population is increasing too. I mean, overall, let's not forget. And there are some interesting projections for the world's population, say in 2050, and those folks are going to go somewhere, and the city is going to be, prime destination. Yes, sir.
I know we're talking a lot about the cities and what the cities are doing, but what are some of the governments doing to limit that immigration? Are they putting incentives to the people to stay in the rural areas? I know with so many people from China traveling away from all of the farming industry out there, there's probably so much less agriculture going on now than there was, say, 10 years ago. What are some of the governments trying to do, or if they are doing anything at all?
Well, about the Chinese government's actions and policies, there are different levels. First of all, for the governments at the receiving areas, they're really trying to, as I said in my presentation, move away from using the migrant population as cheap labor towards incorporating them into the city life fully. This is from the perspective of the receiving areas. But at the same time, from the perspective of the sending areas, they are also trying to attract those migrants back because there is a shortage of labor, and at the same time, they will also want to take advantage of the money, the capital the migrants have accumulated by themselves in the cities. They want to take advantage of that and turn that into some kind of an investment back into their hometown. So there are kinds of, there are a lot of local governments who try to encourage, especially those people who are doing business in the center, in the cities, to come back to the hometown so that they can create additional employment opportunities for their local villages. And so this is a kind of approach, maybe urbanization from the bottom rather than urbanization from the top, from the big cities. And at the same time, from the perspective of the central government rather than from the local government, the central government has realized that right now there's too much concentration in the eastern region, in the big cities. They're really trying to diversify the redistribution of the population into the western region. For example, right now there's this big agenda is called the Western Development Policy. that is to shift the investment from the eastern coastal region into the central region, into the western region, so that hopefully the migrants could be attracted away from those big cities and move into the western area. So those are the different kinds of policy underway.
Anybody else?
In terms of South Asia, since the region is still rural, for example, in India it's only 32% of the population lives in urban areas. In Nepal it is 18%, and in Sri Lanka it's 18%, and Bangladesh is 33%. So since the urbanization is happening, the government hasn't come up with any policies to limit their urbanization process. Rather than, as I showed in the slide, India is trying to limit the growth of megacities. So it's going to support small cities and try to limit that migration to larger cities. But so there's no any policies to restrict or manage the movement.
On the same topic, in the U.S., we had far more metropolitan growth than we did non-metropolitan growth, from 1850 onward. But between 1970 and 1980, we had more non-metropolitan growth, areas like this. This is a non-metropolitan area. Than we did metropolitan growth, because between 70 and 80, bigger cities started losing population, especially in the north. Milwaukee's down now to about 600,000 from 800,000. And so in the U.S., we are doing a better job keeping people in the non-metropolitan areas. In fact, the U.S. Census doesn't call this non-metro anymore. As of 20 years ago, we are called a micropolitan area. Micropolitan. So nobody, I guess, wants to be from someplace that's non. So we're from micropolitan areas. So we've done the areas like this, land's cheaper, labor's cheaper, capital is competitive, superhighways, airports, mass